There is one sheet of paper in this entire business that is worth more than the building, more than the land, more than every machine bolted into every rack inside it combined. And here is the strange part. Most people who charge into this industry don't even learn that the paper exists until the moment they desperately need one and discover the line to get it is years long. They spent a fortune on the wrong things.
They bought dirt.
They hired architects.
They ordered servers.
And they skipped the only thing that actually decides whether any of it will ever earn a cent. So let me walk you through what this business really is, in the order that actually matters, not the order that looks exciting. Start by throwing out the picture in your head. When people imagine a data center, they see a cold room full of blinking lights and neat rows of humming boxes. That image is almost useless. It tells you nothing about the money. Because what you are actually buying, when you buy into this business, is not a room full of computers. You are becoming a landlord, but your tenant isn't a company, and it isn't a person. Your tenant is electricity. Your whole job is to take raw power off the grid, deliver it into the building without ever letting it flicker, and sell the certainty that it will keep flowing. The computers are your customer's problem. The uninterrupted flow of electrons is yours. And that flow is the entire product. There is a nasty catch built into that product, and it is physics. Every single watt of power your customers pull does not disappear into computation and vanish. It comes back out the other side as heat. All of it. A rack of machines is basically a very expensive heater that happens to do math on the side. So the moment you deliver power, you have created a second equally urgent problem. You now have to rip that heat back out of the building faster than it builds up, continuously, or the equipment quietly bakes itself to death in a matter of minutes. That means you are paying twice, once to push power in, and again to drag the heat out. Hold that thought, because it becomes the single biggest number on your bill later. And it is the difference between a business that prints money and one that slowly drowns. Now that paper. Before you fall in love with a plot of land, before you sketch a single wall, you have to answer a question that has nothing to do with construction. Can you actually get the electricity? Not a wire nearby, real capacity, tens or hundreds of megawatts, with a utility willing to sign a promise that it will be delivered by a specific date. A data center doesn't sip from a wall outlet. It taps into the high-voltage transmission grid through a substation that steps monstrous voltage down into something usable. And in the markets where everybody wants to build, the grid is already stretched to its limit by everyone who arrived before you. In the busiest corridors, getting a fresh grid connection approved and switched on can take the better part of a decade. Read that again. Not a season of waiting, years, sometimes half a dozen of them, before a single electron reaches your floor. That is why the most precious object in this entire industry is a signed interconnection agreement, a utility's written commitment to hand you a set amount of power on a set date. In a supply-starved market, that document outclasses the land it's attached to. Which is exactly why the sharpest developers have quietly turned into speculators of power itself. They call it land banking, snapping up parcels that already carry an approved grid connection in the pipeline, then simply sitting on them. A plot bought for a few million can be worth several times that a year later, not because the dirt appreciated, but because the power rights attached to it became impossible for a latecomer to replicate. You are not trading real estate. You are trading a place in the electricity queue. Once you've got the power secured, the second question is where. And this is where the rules invert everything you know about property. In any normal business, you plant yourself near your customers. Here, your customer is a signal that can travel across a continent in milliseconds, so proximity to people is almost irrelevant. What you chase instead is a very specific cocktail: cheap electricity, dense fiber, friendly tax law, and a cold climate that helps with all that heat you're fighting. Nail that mix and you have a shot. Miss it and no amount of clever design saves you. And here's the trap that swallows beginners. The cheapest land in the country is exactly where you must not build. Out on empty rural ground there's no substation, no fiber, no water lines, no real roads. You'll burn tens of millions building all of that yourself, and you'll hand back every dollar you thought you were saving on the plot, plus interest. The regions that actually won this race didn't win on cheap dirt. They won on policy and power price. Some states erase the sales tax on the computing equipment itself, which sounds trivial until you run the arithmetic. Wipe a 7% tax off a $100 million hardware order and you've just kept $7 million in your pocket on one purchase order. Then there's the raw cost of electricity, which varies wildly by geography. Near abundant hydropower, industrial rates can sit around 4 or 5 cents per kilowatt hour. In a congested, power-hungry corridor, you might pay 2 or 3 times that for the identical electron. For a facility running 50 megawatts non-stop, that spread alone is worth tens of millions of dollars every single year forever. That's not a rounding error. That single choice quietly decides whether your business is healthy or terminal, before you've even poured the foundation. Alright, say you've locked the power and picked your spot. Now you build. And the biggest mental mistake here is thinking of this as putting up a warehouse. It is nothing like a warehouse. In a warehouse, the physical structure, slab, steel, roof, is the overwhelming majority of what you spend, maybe 80%. Flip that completely for a data center. The shell, the actual building you can see and walk into, is only around 15 to 20% of the cost. The other 80+% is invisible from the outside. It's electrical guts, cooling machinery, backup power, and networking. You're not really constructing a building at all. You're constructing an industrial-scale electrical machine and wrapping a modest roof around it so the rain stays off. Peel that machine open and you can see where the money hides. The electrical systems eat the largest share, usually 40 to 50% of the whole build. The substation on your land, the transformers, the switchgear that routes power through the building, and the banks of batteries whose only purpose is to keep everything alive for the 10 to 30 seconds it takes backup generators to fire up during a grid failure. Those generators, big diesel units parked outside, can run the entire site for a day or more on stored fuel. Every layer of that redundancy exists for one blunt reason. If a customer's systems go dark for even half a minute, they can drag you into court and win. Next comes cooling, another 15 to 20%, all of it dedicated to that heat problem from earlier. And then the shell itself, floors reinforced to hold cabinets as heavy as cars, fire suppression, biometric doors, cameras, finished interiors, plus the fiber, run in from several directions to several carriers so no single severed cable can ever black out the whole building. Here's the number that hurts. A mid-sized facility delivering 10 megawatts of usable power lands somewhere around $80 to $120 million. Scale it to 50 megawatts and you're between 4 and 600 million. And if you build it specifically for modern AI hardware, with its extreme appetite, the cost can climb past $14 million for every single megawatt, meaning a 100 megawatt AI campus can blow past $1.5 billion before a single customer plugs anything in. And that is the exact moment the real danger begins. Not during construction. After. Because the day the building is finished and empty is the day the bleeding starts. You financed most of this with debt, and large infrastructure debt currently runs somewhere in the 6 to 8% range. That interest doesn't politely wait for tenants to show up. Think of it as a meter that starts spinning the instant you break ground, and keeps spinning whether the building is packed or completely hollow. A $200 million project at 7% burns roughly $14 million a year just in interest, with zero customers inside. The meter runs before the money does. That single fact is why everything from here on out is really about one thing: filling the building fast with tenants who won't leave. So who pays you and how? There are two very different ways to sell the space, and they lead to two very different lives.
The first is retail colocation.
A regional bank or a mid-sized firm doesn't want the headache of running its own server room, so it rents a locked cage or a couple of cabinets from you, and you supply the power, the cooling, the security. You might charge that tenant $100 to $200 per kilowatt each month. On a small 5 kilowatt cabinet that's $500 to $1,000 monthly, and stacked across hundreds of tenants, it throws off strong revenue per square foot. But it also demands a real sales team constantly hunting small deals, and small tenants are twitchy. They come and go far more than the big ones. The second way is wholesale, or hyperscale, leasing, and it's a completely different game. Instead of chasing hundreds of little tenants, you sign one contract with a giant, and that giant takes an entire building, or a huge slice of one, on a lease running 10 to 15 years. Your rate per kilowatt drops, maybe to $80 or $110 a month, but what you get in exchange is almost supernatural predictability. A signed 15-year lease with a financially bulletproof tenant is a guaranteed river of cash for a decade and a half. And this is the part that separates the pros from the amateurs. That lease is not just income. It is collateral. You can carry it into a bank and borrow against it more cheaply, because the lender can see to the dollar exactly how much money is coming and for how long. A building backed by years of signed revenue from creditworthy tenants can borrow at rates half a point to a full point below a building with empty floors. And on a billion-dollar project, half a point is $5 million a year. The contract literally lowers the price of your money. If any of this is landing for you, do me a quick favor and hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who like pulling businesses apart to see how they actually run. Now back to it, because that gorgeous long lease hides a blade.
The blade is concentration.
Picture yourself building a 50 megawatt facility and handing the whole thing to a single cloud giant. On paper it's flawless, 100% full, revenue you can set your watch by, clean and simple books. But you've just built a business whose survival hangs entirely on one tenant deciding to stay. And when that lease expires in 10 or 15 years, or if they simply choose not to renew, you're left holding a building custom-shaped around that one tenant's precise power density and cooling layout, now sitting dark, still feeding the interest meter, earning nothing. The world of commercial property is haunted by this exact ghost. One giant anchor signs, the developer builds around them, and years later they walk and the building becomes a liability nobody wants. In data centers it stings worse, because the facility was optimized so tightly for one setup that retrofitting it for anyone else costs a fortune. The safer-looking alternative, hundreds of small tenants, protects you from any single exit, but it costs more to run, churns constantly, and never stops needing to be refilled. The operators who actually endure usually land in between, a backbone of big anchors for stability, wrapped in smaller tenants for margin. Now let me introduce the villain that keeps every owner staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m.
The power bill.
This isn't a modest line item. Electricity typically runs 60 to 80% of everything you spend to keep the doors open. And it's driven not only by how much your customers use, but by how much you waste getting it to them. The industry boils this down to a single ratio called PUE. You take all the power flowing into the building and divide it by the power that actually reaches the customer's machines. A flawless building with zero waste would score a perfect 1.0, which doesn't exist anywhere on Earth. Real facilities live between roughly 1.15 for a ruthlessly efficient modern design and 2.0 or worse for an old leaky one, where for every watt doing real work you burn a second watt on cooling and losses and lights. Put it in dollars, a 50 megawatt site at 7-cent power, running an inefficient ratio, can waste something on the order of $10 million a year purely on overhead the customer never touches. Tighten that ratio with smarter cooling and you claw back millions annually, straight to profit, every year forever. This one number is the biggest lever you'll ever pull. And then AI showed up and rewrote the rules, the customer that changed everything. The demand is real and staggering, larger than anything this industry has ever absorbed. But it arrives strapped to requirements that are brutally more expensive to satisfy. A normal enterprise cabinet draws maybe 5 to 10 kilowatts. A cabinet packed with the top chips used to train large AI models draws 40, 60, and the newest designs are shoving past 100 kilowatts into a single rack. That is not simply more power, it's a different category of engineering problem entirely. Past roughly 40 kilowatts, blowing cold air over the machine stops working. The air physically cannot carry heat away fast enough. You have to pipe liquid coolant directly onto the chips. That plumbing is expensive to install, expensive to maintain, and it forces changes to the building itself, because these dense AI racks weigh so much more that old floors were never designed to hold them. So an AI-optimized building can cost $14 to $20 million per megawatt against maybe 8 to 12 for a conventional one, but here's the other side of that coin. The revenue per kilowatt for AI-grade capacity is also far higher, because the AI companies need this infrastructure yesterday and cannot build it fast enough themselves. The question nobody can answer with any certainty is whether that fatter revenue outruns the fatter cost, and for how long. AI hardware evolves at a terrifying pace. The chip you designed a building around today might be obsolete in 3 years, replaced by something that needs a completely different cooling setup. Building a specialized AI facility right now is, at bottom, a wager that the rich margins over the next few years more than repay the extra cost before the whole thing needs re-engineering. Most of the big players are placing that bet. But it is a bet, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Let me put real numbers on the table so none of this floats in the abstract. Picture a facility with 30 megawatts of customer-facing capacity that you built for around $300 million. You financed 70% of it, $210 million, with debt at 7%, so you owe roughly $15 million a year in interest, and you sank $90 million of your own equity into it. Fill it with wholesale tenants averaging $100 per kilowatt per month, and 30 megawatts throws off about $36 million a year in power revenue. Add cross-connect fees, the physical cables linking one tenant's network to another inside your building, which carry margins north of 90%, plus managed services, and a well-run site might pull in the low 40s of millions at full occupancy. Now the costs. Electricity for 30 megawatts at a decent ratio and 7-cent power run somewhere around $24 million a year, and staff, maintenance, insurance and property costs add several million more. So you're spending roughly the high 20s to 30 million to run it, taking in the low 40s, and clearing maybe 12 to 14 million in operating income before debt. Subtract that 15 million of interest and in the early years, you are barely breaking even, or slightly underwater, on a $300 million asset. It gets better as the debt pays down, and dramatically better if you refinance cheaper once the building is stable. But it shows you the whole truth of this business in one line: occupancy is everything. Slide from full to 70% and that income collapses toward barely covering interest. Slide to 50 and you have a genuine emergency. An empty room here isn't neutral. It is actively eating you alive. There's also a formal scale for how bulletproof a facility is, rated in tiers from 1 to 4, and it really comes down to a single question: how paranoid can you afford to be? Tier 1 has essentially no backup. One part fails and the building can go dark, so nobody serious runs anything important there. Tier 4 is total redundancy on everything. 2 utility feeds, 2 independent power paths, 2 independent cooling systems, so any single failure anywhere causes exactly zero downtime. That's what big banks, cloud providers and governments demand on paper. But climbing from Tier 3 to Tier 4 adds something like $5 to $8 million per megawatt, and you had better be able to charge for that paranoia, because the quiet reality is that plenty of customers who insist on Tier 4 suddenly make peace with Tier 3 the moment they see the invoice. Operators who overbuilt and then couldn't fill their fortress at fortress prices paid dearly for guessing wrong. Before the last piece, here's something worth keeping in your back pocket. If you enjoy this kind of ground-level teardown of how real businesses make and lose money, there's a deeper business breakdown linked down in the description and the pinned comment that lays out the financial frameworks running underneath industries exactly like this one. Now, today, because this moment is genuinely unlike anything the sector has lived through. The demand pouring out of AI isn't a normal cycle. The largest technology companies on the planet have collectively committed to spending hundreds of billions of dollars on computing infrastructure over the next few years. At that scale, the bottleneck has flipped entirely. It used to be finding customers. Now the customers are guaranteed and the shortages are physical: electricity and equipment. Grid capacity is the hardest wall. In the prime markets, developers wait years for new connections, which means a company deciding to build today may not have power flowing until deep into the next decade, and that single fact is shoving development into smaller secondary markets wherever power can be locked down faster. The gear is short too. The big transformers carry lead times of 2 to 3 years, and switchgear, generators and cooling systems are all backlogged. Developers have signed leases with hyperscale tenants and then found themselves unable to build fast enough because the equipment was stuck in a factory queue, contractually on the hook to deliver power they physically could not yet produce. That's not a hypothetical. It has happened more than once. There's a strange gravity to all of this, too, and it's worth understanding because it explains why the crowded markets stay crowded even when they're choking. Once a region fills up with data centers, it becomes more attractive to the next builder, not less, despite the power queues, despite the higher land prices. The reason is fiber. Every facility that gets built lays more cable and pulls in more carriers, and dense, redundant, competitive fiber is exactly what big tenants demand. So the very congestion that makes power hard to get is sitting right next to the connectivity that makes the location irresistible. That's why a handful of markets came to dominate the entire industry and won't easily let go. The infrastructure compounds on itself. For you, the operator, it means the obvious spots are obvious for real reasons, but you'll pay through the nose and wait in line for them, while the cheaper, emptier alternatives are cheaper and emptier for reasons that can quietly wreck your economics. Choosing between those two is one of the first and most consequential bets you'll ever place, and you place it before you've earned a single dollar. And history already showed how fast this can curdle. A decade or so back, a wave of developers built in secondary markets on cheap land and available power, modeling their lease up on the boom happening in the hottest primary corridors. The demand never followed them out there. Buildings sat half empty for years. When interest rates climbed, debt costs rose while revenue stayed flat, and some of those facilities were sold for a fraction of what they cost to build. A few were foreclosed outright. The lesson isn't that data centers are bad. It's that a data center is a ferociously capital-intensive illiquid asset with enormous fixed costs. And if even one link in the chain snaps, if tenants arrive slower than you modeled, if power prices jump, if rates rise, if a rival floods your market at the worst possible moment, the whole thing can swing from beautiful to catastrophic with shocking speed. So strip it all the way down. The people who win here over and over are not the ones who built the biggest, shiniest buildings. They're the ones who understood from day one that the building was never the point, it was just the container. The real business is getting power that others simply cannot get, building reliability that customers cannot live without, and signing contracts that lock in revenue before the concrete has even cured, then using those contracts to borrow cheaper than everyone else and do it all again. It is a business about controlling something scarce. And the scarcest thing in the entire digital economy right now is not chips. Chips can be bought if you can afford them. The scarcest thing is reliable electricity, delivered at massive scale, with a utility sign promise that it will still be flowing in 20 years. As AI keeps devouring more power than any computing era before it, the operator who quietly locked in that grid connection 5 years ago is sitting on something far more valuable than they probably realized when they signed it. That's the whole business, hiding in plain sight.
Not the servers. Not the buildings. Not the fiber. Megawatts.
And who ends up controlling the megawatts in the age of AI may turn out to be one of the most important economic questions of the entire decade. If you got something out of this, drop a like and subscribe. It takes 2 seconds and it helps more than you'd think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.